Okay, good morning, everyone. For the next 15 minutes, it is still morning. We're going to be moving forward today, and we're going to be talking about the autonomic nervous system. But before we get to that, a couple announcements. Exam looked way better this time. Congratulations. Median was up a full letter grade, up to an 84. A note for those of you who are still having a bit of trouble. I haven't really seen any faces in office hours, but that is time for you to be coming to talk to me and tell me that you are confused. So I have a new system, because if your schedule didn't previously allow you to come to my office hours, I have now made a lot more times available, because if I only have to be in my office when I know you are coming, I can give you lots and lots of time on my schedule. So I now have a booking calendar. This is available in the announcements on Brightspace as well. So this is what it looks like for next week. And another note about the announcements that I just posted. Okay. The other thing I'm sharing with you is a guide to ways to study. So if you have a study group, you can use this as a study group guide, but even if you don't, this has some helpful tips about how you can be asking questions. So after lectures, if you're thinking weekly, you should be identifying the point that was most confusing for you in each lecture, so that you can figure out the answers to why that was unclear, what you're misunderstanding. I have to write quiz questions, so you can also write yourselves quiz questions. Think through the same process as I would be thinking when I write your own. And you want to plan a question to be asking me, your SITAs, or the TAs in the anatomy lab, depending on what the topic is. If you're figuring out how to ask me a question, how to ask a TA a question, I wrote you some question Mad Libs of ways that you might be thinking about asking a question. So these first two are for the anatomy lab, ways you might ask questions of those TAs. Here we have a couple of ways you might ask questions about lecture content, asking about specific topics. A good way to practice is to come to someone who knows the material, feels really comfortable with the material. You explain it to them, and then they tell you if you were right, tell you what you missed, where you went wrong. And you can come do that with me in office hours. Okay, so these are some tips that you can consult as you are studying. Okay. So now back to our regularly scheduled content. So we're going to be talking about the nervous system. We're actually going to talk about the autonomic nervous system first. We'll come back to the somatic nervous system as we move into our muscles. Okay. So up to this point, what we have thought about is the central nervous system. Right? You've seen the brain and the spinal cord in lab. We've been talking about neurons. We've largely been talking about neurons in the brain. Now we're going to be branching out into the periphery. So the periphery out towards the edges of your body. So things coming out of the brain or out of the spinal cord. So that's our peripheral nervous system. The peripheral nervous system has branches. So this is a big map, right? So one thing we have in the peripheral nervous system is signals coming in, right? You touch something, you feel it. You feel it because you have a signal coming in, right? There's a mechanoreceptor or something in your finger, feeling mechanical touch, feeling pressure, right? That triggers that receptor, and a nerve sends that information into your central nervous system. So that's this side of this map. So your sensory nerves, we're going to refer to as afferent fibers. So afferent nerves, afferent, are transmitting information from receptors. So they're feeling things out in the world, and they're taking that information and bringing it into the central nervous system. So visceral means like your organs. So they're transmitting information from other parts of your body into the central nervous system. Okay. So this is important in maintaining homeostasis, because we're not always going to be thinking about touching something physically, right? A lot of our receptors are going to be sensing things like temperature, things like blood pressure, things that are regulated variables. so it can be important for maintaining homeostasis. Okay, so those would also, in the same way, have signals coming in. Mhm. Okay. Let me see what that is. I'll go through your bright space. What link do you have? Okay. Okay. This looks the same to me. What's the difference here? I think it's just doesn't have these other bullet points, right? But we can work on that. I'll double check if you have like an actual slide that's not on there. Sorry, I guess I'm not seeing the difference. Can you tell me what the difference was? Oh, okay, I see. Okay, we'll do this. Sorry. Sometimes I can't do that spot the difference picture, I guess. Okay, but still, we are still talking about these branches. Okay, so we got our afferent, our signals, okay, on this side. And then we're going to have the efferent fibers on the other side, okay? So the efferent fibers are sending anything out. So they're sending anything out to the body over here, right? So that's the efferent portion. We refer to these as motor commands, but they're not always going to be things that you're thinking about typically as motor, right? When we think about motor stuff, we often think about like moving our skeletal muscle. That is specifically going to be the somatic nervous system. So these efferent fibers, while they're called motor fibers, are often going to be sending out directions to things you don't consciously think about. And that's what the autonomic nervous system is. It's like your unconscious, involuntary part of the nervous system. So autonomic, you can kind of think automatic. These are going to be automatic processes that you don't think about. So it's essentially going to be a branch of these efferent. So think efferent like effect, right? Efferent fibers have an effect out on the body. Okay. So these efferent fibers are either going to be part of the somatic nervous system, moving skeletal muscle, or they're going to be part of what we're talking about today and probably ongoing next week, our autonomic nervous system, which is automatic, involuntary. You don't think about it. You probably don't even notice it, but it is really important for having the effects in maintaining homeostasis. So the targets for your autonomic nervous system are going to be smooth muscle. Smooth muscle we're going to see in the walls of blood vessels and in the walls of things like the gut. Cardiac muscle is another target of our autonomic nervous system. So your heart is a muscle, right? And that heart muscle, not under your voluntary control, it's under the control of the autonomic nervous system. And then the other thing that's going to be under the control of our autonomic nervous system is gland. The things where we're secreting hormones, things like that. Our glands are going to be effector organs. So we're going to be hanging out for a while here in this little branch of the peripheral nervous system, having these effects on the body. As you can see, we are going to have a lot of comparisons within the autonomic nervous system as we talk about differences between the parasympathetic division and the sympathetic division, right? So this is the two branches of our autonomic nervous system. We're going to be doing a lot of compare and contrast here. Okay. So in the autonomic nervous system, if you think about a specific effector organ, say the heart, right? You're not going to have just parasympathetic nerves. Sorry, I'll go back. I don't know if I said these words out loud yet. These two divisions are the parasympathetic division and the sympathetic division. So we're going to have mixed innervation, parasympathetic and sympathetic. Okay. So both of these divisions, the parasympathetics and the sympathetics, are going to be innervating effector organs. So say we're talking about our heart, right? The heart is not just under the control of the parasympathetic nervous system. It's not just under the control of the sympathetic branch of the nervous system. It's under control of both. So we're going to think about the sympathetics and the parasympathetics as almost kind of like a dimmer switch, right? Like we're toggling between light and dark, not an on-off kind of switch usually. So we're going to have both divisions innervating our effector organs. Okay. So the autonomic nervous system is kind of secret from you, right? You don't know that it's working. And usually the effects of the parasympathetic branch of the autonomic nervous system versus the sympathetic effects of that nervous system are going to be opposite to each other. They're going to be antagonistic. So we often refer to the parasympathetic nervous system as the like rest and digest portion of the nervous system. We often refer to the sympathetic nervous system as our fight or flight response. Right, so sympathetic, I think about that S, like sympathetic, like stress, basically. The sympathetics are really activating a lot of energetic sort of effects in your body. So we're going to have a lot of unconscious processes that are going to help us maintain homeostasis, that are going to be the responsibility of these two branches of the autonomic nervous system. Okay. So now we're thinking about where these nerves come from, because there is a physical division between where nerves that are part of your sympathetic nervous system start and where nerves that are part of your part of your parasympathetic nervous system start. So what we're looking at here, all right, okay. So our sympathetic nervous system, all of these nerves are coming out of the thorax and our first two lumbar vertebrae. So we often refer to the origin of these nerves as thoracolumbar, right? So they're coming from nerves that are leaving the spinal cord, essentially in your chest, your back, slightly down into your lower back. Okay. Our parasympathetic nervous system isn't coming from any of those regions. All your parasympathetics either come from cranial nerves or they come from the sacrum. So we refer to these nerves as craniosacral in origin, right? They're not coming from any of these middle levels of the spinal cord. They're either coming from these cranial nerves from your brain, specifically cranial nerves 3, 7, 9, and 10. 10, the vagus, as you can see, is going to be the most active, doing all sorts of stuff here. Okay. Or we're going to get innervation from the sacrum into essentially the pelvis and the lower portions of the abdomen. So they're coming from different places, but you can see, look at the heart, right? We have sympathetics coming to it. We have parasympathetics coming to it. We look at the lungs, we got sympathetic, we got parasympathetic. So each of these organs is receiving innervation from both of these branches. So when we look at the anatomy of a nerve in the autonomic nervous system, our neurons are going to link up together in a specific way. So in our last unit, we talked about presynaptic and postsynaptic neurons. This is a similar sort of division, except now we're going to call them preganglionic and postganglionic neurons. Okay. So as we're taking a path to an effector organ, so say we're going to the heart, right? We're going to have a preganglionic neuron that starts in the central nervous system, so either in the brain or the spinal cord. It's going to branch out. Its axon is going to extend into the periphery, so it's leaving the spinal cord. All right, that's our preganglionic neuron. Then we're going to have a postganglionic neuron. And the postganglionic neuron starts and ends out in the peripheral nervous system. So it's going to start somewhere out in the body, and it's going to send its axon out and its axon terminals out to the effector organs, which are either going to be cardiac muscle, so your heart, smooth muscle, glands. Actually, fat is also a target, adipose tissue of our autonomic nervous system. Okay. So the second one is the postganglionic nervous system. A ganglion is just a place where you see cell bodies. That's why the term is a little different here. So when we think about autonomic ganglia, we're thinking about communication from the preganglionic neuron to the postganglionic neuron happening right here. Okay. Some places we will see intrinsic neurons, so we'll see neurons like in the body of an effector organ. And here are effector organ targets. That's our general setup. Okay. So our preganglionic neurons are originating in the thoracolumbar section of the spinal cord, so in the thorax and the lumbar region. Specifically, they're coming from a region inside of the spinal cord called the interomedial cell column. And what we are going to be looking at, right? The most typical route for a sympathetic nerve is to have a short preganglionic neuron going to this structure called the sympathetic chain. So the sympathetic chain, this is the sympathetic chain. It's literally a chain of ganglia that lies kind of parallel to your spine, right? So you would actually physically be able to see this. It has these swellings along it, kind of white in color. Okay? So it's where we locate a lot of cell bodies. So we're going to have a short preganglionic neuron going into this chain. And you'll notice that when we're in the chain, a nerve could kind of go to a different level, right? So it can kind of go up and down the chain if it wants. Then we are going to have a longer postganglionic neuron going out to an effector organ. Okay, so usually we have a short preganglionic neuron and then a longer route out to an effector organ. Okay, I trace the line here. Okay. So our ganglia here, say this T2 nerve, this T3 nerve, are all linked together in that sympathetic chain. So our exception to this system is when we're talking about nerves from the sympathetic nervous system that are going to our adrenal cortex, our adrenal medulla. So we're going to be having our adrenal glands sit on top of our kidneys. Right. So they are still going to have a preganglionic neuron. Right. So we're going to have a preganglionic neuron going here through the wall of our adrenal gland and into the center. And here we have something called a chromaffin cell. Okay, so the chromaffin cell is basically a modified postganglionic cell, but it doesn't like really have an axon. It's like a little different in shape. So these cells are going to release epinephrine and they're going to release norepinephrine, which are going to be the neurotransmitters or hormones that we expect to see as part of our sympathetic nervous system. So here's the epinephrine coming up here. So here we see a map of our different routes. Okay. So most of our nerves are going through the preganglionic neuron, into the sympathetic chain, into the postganglionic neuron, and then out to an effector organ. Some of them are going all the way from our spinal cord into the center, the adrenal medulla, into the center of that adrenal gland to synapse with a chromaffin cell. Okay. And a couple of them, there are a couple collateral ganglia out in the body. So collateral ganglion is just another place where we see a collection of cell bodies. It just doesn't happen to be linked out into this sympathetic chain. Okay. And so it's going to have its synapse just out into a separate ganglion, out into an effector organ. So those are the three routes that we see for our sympathetic nervous system. Sorry, without my text, I don't remember what the red text was. Okay. Same sign. Yeah. Okay. for our sympathetic pathways, right? Preganglionic nerve is going from the ventral root of our spinal cord, going into a spinal nerve, coming into the sympathetic chain. So that's what we see here, right? That's still that pathway. And then we just have this postganglionic neuron leaving this ganglion and going out to our effector organ. That's all we're interested in. Okay. So our postganglionic neurons are leaving the ganglia. Technically, we wanted to talk about these pathways on and off of the sympathetic chain. We refer to this first root with the preganglionic neuron as the white ramus, and the second one where the postganglionic nerve is as the gray ramus. But don't worry about that for our purposes for right now. Okay. So we're traveling out to our effector organ. Okay. So our only difference with the collateral ganglia is that we are not synapsing in the sympathetic chain. We'd have another ganglion like over here. Okay. All right. So our parasympathetic nerves look a little different because they're not at all involved with the sympathetic chain. Okay. So a preganglionic neuron in the parasympathetic nervous system is going to start in the brainstem or in the spinal cord in the region that's in the sacrum. So they're starting in the brain or in the sacral spinal cord. And now instead of having a short preganglionic neuron, we're going to have a longer preganglionic neuron. This is going to be longer. Okay. And then we're going to have our effector organ with a postganglionic neuron be relatively shorter. Okay. So short postganglionic neurons to those effector organs. All right. So our parasympathetic nerves, don't need to memorize these right now. You learned the cranial nerves in anatomy lab, but so that we link those up. Our cranial nerves that carry parasympathetic innervation are cranial nerve 10, the vagus nerve, cranial nerve 3, the oculomotor nerve, cranial nerve 7, the facial nerve, and cranial nerve 9, the glossopharyngeal nerve. Okay. So they're special for that reason. And then the pelvic nerves, these sacral nerves are also part of our parasympathetic system. So we're thinking about these preganglionic neurons in the brainstem or the sacral spinal cord. We have our long preganglionic neuron, and then we're out to the effector organ with a relatively short connection. So now we're going to talk about the chemical messengers involved. Okay. So when we talk about cholinergic receptors, we're going to be talking about acetylcholine, which is abbreviated ACH. When we talk about adrenergic receptors, we're talking about norepinephrine, a hormone. Okay, so adrenergic receptors actually come from this word adrenaline, but we don't use that word in the US. That's more of like a British term. So we're thinking norepinephrine. Okay. So simple thing about the autonomic nervous system is that any preganglionic neuron, whether it's part of the sympathetic or the parasympathetics, is going to be releasing acetylcholine. Okay, so we're always releasing acetylcholine from a preganglionic neuron. From our postganglionic neurons, we are going to be releasing acetylcholine only if we're thinking about the parasympathetics. Okay, so if we're thinking about a parasympathetic pathway, we'd have our preganglionic neuron releases acetylcholine, synapsing with the postganglionic neuron, then that postganglionic neuron also releases acetylcholine. Done. We're thinking about a sympathetic neuron, a sympathetic nervous pathway. We're thinking our sympathetic preganglionic neuron releases acetylcholine. That's received by the postganglionic neuron. But then that postganglionic neuron is usually going to be releasing norepinephrine. Our exception being if we're talking about those specialized chromatin cells in the adrenal medulla, so in the center of the adrenal glands, which are going to be releasing some norepinephrine, but are mostly releasing epinephrine. So this is what that looks like. Okay. So here we see the sympathetic nervous system, and we see our different roots, right? So we would refer to a neuron that releases acetylcholine as a cholinergic neuron. So cholinergic neuron releases acetylcholine. Okay. That acetylcholine is now in the synapse, synapsing on the cell body in this ganglion with our postganglionic neuron. So that postganglionic neuron is going to have a cholinergic receptor, cholinergic because it's receiving the acetylcholine. But the postganglionic neuron in the sympathetic nervous system, we'd refer to the neuron as a whole as adrenergic because of what it releases. So adrenergic because it releases norepinephrine. Our adrenergic receptors, we would therefore see in the target organs of our effector organs. Okay. So an adrenergic receptor is receiving that norepinephrine. Okay. An effector organ receiving the norepinephrine has an adrenergic receptor. The same sort of arrangement is going to be true for our other roots of the sympathetic nervous system. So our preganglionic neuron is going to be cholinergic because it releases acetylcholine. Our chromaffin cells are going to have receptors for that acetylcholine. So they're going to have cholinergic receptors, but they themselves we would consider adrenergic because they release epinephrine and norepinephrine. And then our adrenergic receptors would be on the target organs. This last one is showing us the root with our collateral ganglion. So you can see that's pretty much the same thing as our first one with the sympathetic chain. So we have a cholinergic neuron releasing acetylcholine, an adrenergic neuron that releases norepinephrine. But in the synapse between the two, we have some cholinergic receptors. That's our parasympathetic nervous system is way easier because all we have to think about is acetylcholine. So we have a cholinergic neuron as our preganglionic neuron. It releases acetylcholine. We have a cholinergic receptor. Our postganglionic neuron is also cholinergic. It also releases acetylcholine. There's another cholinergic receptor. So associate the parasympathetic nervous system with acetylcholine, just always. So when we think about acetylcholine, there are going to be two receptor types for that. So for our two receptor types, we're going to have nicotinic cholinergic receptors, and we're going to have muscarinic cholinergic receptors. Okay. So in a nicotinic cholinergic receptors, and this is literally named after nicotine, okay, it causes cation channels to open, right? So it's going to allow positive ions to move across our membrane. And this overall is going to result in depolarization, right? So that's how it's exciting the next cell. In our muscarinic cholinergic receptors, it's a more complicated system. So we talked about our G protein coupled receptors, right? When we talked about those metabotropic receptors in our synapses, right? So this was the version that took a little longer. We can have more varied effects. So our muscarinic cholinergic receptors, the effect is going to depend on what's going on in that target cell. So the nicotinic cholinergic receptors are just going to go ahead, depolarize the next cell, send on the next signal. But our muscarinic cholinergic receptors are going to receive that signal and then do something with it, but not necessarily depolarize. This means that we're going to see those nicotinic cholinergic receptors a lot in those ganglia between our preganglionic and postganglionic cells. But those muscarinic cholinergic receptors, we're going to see a lot at our effector organs. So for those cholinergic receptors, in the autonomic system on the postganglionic neuron, we're going to have a nicotinic cholinergic receptor. So what I'm saying there, right? So our preganglionic neuron, was the first one. So this was our preganglionic. Our postganglionic neuron was the second one. So postganglionic. So what we're saying when we say that the postganglionic neuron is associated with these nicotinic cholinergic receptors, what we're saying is that that's the type of receptor we would see like right here. Okay. And that's because our preganglionic neurons, regardless of parasympathetic, sympathetic, are releasing acetylcholine. So we're seeing them on the postganglionic neuron because they're receiving that acetylcholine signal, which is great because that means that our preganglionic neuron fires, releases acetylcholine. The simple receptor opens those cation channels, causes depolarization, and our postganglionic neuron then fires. If we are thinking about our effector organs, so those are our target cells, right? So we're going to pick the heart as our effector organ over here. Okay. So in our effector organ, if we're thinking about the parasympathetic nervous system and its effects, this is when we will see our other type of cholinergic receptor, right? So if we are now thinking about a parasympathetic nerve, we'd still be releasing acetylcholine. Okay. But now we're going to have this G protein coupled receptor with a more complicated potential response in this affected organ. So that is our muscarinic cholinergic receptor. So the muscarinic is that one. The nicotinic is that first one. Now, when we're thinking about skeletal muscle, when we talk about the somatic nervous system later, skeletal muscle contracts in response to a nerve, like sending an action potential. So we can also think about skeletal muscle as kind of like excitable. This is still going to have to do with like passing charges down. So when we talk about that, our skeletal muscle is also going to have nicotinic cholinergic receptors on it, because essentially we also want to depolarize skeletal muscle in order to make it contract. Okay. Sweat glands are a sort of separate exception. They happen to have muscarinic cholinergic receptors. And when we think about adrenergic receptors, things get a little more complicated. Okay. So when we think about adrenergic receptors, we have two main classes, alpha receptors and beta receptors. And about your slides, I suspect that they're shorter and it cuts down on the information if there are slides missing. So this is just a longer explanation. You just need to know what's on those. Okay. So if they're adrenergic receptors, we're going to divide them into alpha receptors and beta receptors. So here are alpha receptors. We have two types. Okay. And we're going to have beta receptors. We have three types. So when we're thinking about adrenergic receptors, we're thinking about our sympathetic nervous system. Okay, so we're thinking about our sympathetic nervous system with its preganglionic fiber, right? Okay. That was not our adrenergic neuron yet, right? Because this one released acetylcholine as it communicates with our postganglionic neuron. Okay. So postganglionic neuron. This is the one that's adrenergic. Okay. This postganglionic neuron in the sympathetic nervous system is adrenergic because it is releasing mostly norepinephrine, but also maybe epinephrine. Okay. So this is our norepinephrine. So when we're talking about our adrenergic receptors, we're talking about cells that are receiving that signal, right? So I'm going to just pick, for example, the heart, right? So we're now thinking about receptors on our effector organ that are receiving that signal from norepinephrine or from epinephrine. So this is where we're focusing now. So this receptor could be one of 5 things. It could be an alpha-1 receptor, an alpha-2 receptor, beta-1, beta-2, beta-3. And we are going to talk about throughout our systems where specifically we find each of these receptors. All of these are going to be coupled to G proteins. So all of our adrenergic receptors are metabotropic receptors. They have this slow response, this sort of like more varied response. So for our alpha adrenergic receptors, they're going to be in the effector organs of the sympathetic nervous system. They're the most common and they're usually excitatory. Okay? They have an affinity that's greater for norepinephrine than for epinephrine. For our beta adrenergic receptors, the way you can recognize a beta adrenergic receptor is it's going to activate cyclic AMP, which is a second messenger. So cyclic AMP is getting created here, right? So here's our cyclic AMP. Okay. Cyclic AMP down here, right? So here we see a beta receptor receiving some epinephrine or norepinephrine. Okay. The G protein gets activated. We create cyclic AMP. And in this image specifically, which is from your textbook, it's important to notice this plus because they are showing you a difference here between the beta receptors and the alpha-2 receptors, which can be a little confusing because the alpha-2 receptor is still a G protein coupled receptor. And if you were to describe its pathway, you'd still talk about cyclic AMP, but what it does is stop production of cyclic AMP. So this word activate is actually important when we're talking about the beta adrenergic receptors. So our adrenergic receptors are going to be located in different places, and we will talk about those as we get to these systems. But the beta-1 adrenergic receptors in general are going to be in your cardiac muscle and your kidneys. They're going to usually be excitatory. Beta-1 receptors, like norepinephrine and epinephrine, the same amount, they have equal affinity. Our beta-2 adrenergic receptors are going to be in some of your blood vessels and your smooth muscle. They're usually going to be inhibitory on those cells, and they're going to like epinephrine more than they like norepinephrine. The beta-3 adrenergic receptors, they're going to be located in adipose tissue. They're usually going to be excitatory, and they are going to have equal affinity for norepinephrine as they do for epinephrine, just like those beta-1 receptors did. So we have a chart, basically, and that's probably what I left you with, right? So the way we are looking at this, so we have our alpha receptors, alpha-1 and alpha-2, okay? And what we notice about the alpha receptors is that they prefer norepinephrine to epinephrine. So norepinephrine and epinephrine are similar chemically, so our receptors can bind to either of these molecules, but some of the receptors prefer one to the other. So if we're looking at a receptor and it prefers norepinephrine to epinephrine, we have an alpha receptor, alpha-1 or alpha-2. To tell these two apart, once we have that information, we can look at how that signal is being transduced, so like how it's being like processed in the cell, essentially. So to tell them apart, what I would do is look for cyclic AMP. So if you see a receptor that prefers norepinephrine to epinephrine, and you see cyclic AMP, that tells you you have an alpha-2 receptor. So our alpha receptors prefer norepinephrine. One of them inhibits cyclic AMP. The other one activates something called IP3, different pathway. And both of them are going to excite the effector organ. Honestly, we mostly care about the beta receptors. That's what we'll talk about in future units. So our beta receptors, we're going to identify them. One way is that they're going to activate cyclic AMP. So if we have something activating cyclic AMP, means we have a beta receptor. We see we have different effects over here at the end. Okay. And we have some different affinities here, depending on our beta receptors and our beta 3 receptors, or beta 1, 2, and 3 receptors. So our beta 1 receptors see norepinephrine and epinephrine the same. They don't have a preference. They will bind to either of them. Our beta 2 receptors highly prefer epinephrine to norepinephrine. Okay. So if we see something that highly prefers epinephrine to norepinephrine, we know we have a beta 2 receptor. We don't see that anywhere else in this chart, right? This is the only place we see epinephrine first, right? So if we like epinephrine, beta 2 receptor. So if we like epinephrine, beta 2 receptor. Our beta 1 receptors are probably what we're talking about otherwise. The way to tell apart a beta 3 receptor is really the effector organ, which is adipose tissue. So basically, we will not spend much time talking about beta 3 receptors at all. Right. And those are just some examples of drugs that affect different types of receptors and different parts of the autonomic nervous system. So we don't have to go through them, but you'll notice that a lot of these are affecting our adrenergic receptors, right? So we see these receptor names all over the place, right? So affecting these receptors is a really good way to have some type of effect on these effector organs, which are really important, right? Like fixing the heart, fixing your blood vessels, and therefore your blood pressure, lung, anyway, no, not really lungs. Fixing these receptors, affecting these receptors is a good way to affect the body. I think, is that where I stopped you? No. Okay, we did talk about this. So one last thing here. We're going to think very briefly about how we link up to that effector organ. Okay. So we are going to have a synapse between our nerve and our effector organ, right? So we've had our preganglionic neuron to a ganglia, to the postganglionic neuron, to the effector organ, and now we're on the effector organ itself. So we're talking here, okay? So we're going to have a synapse between that postganglionic neuron and our effector organ. So when we're talking about the autonomic nervous system and its neuroeffector junction, so neuro because of the neuron, effector because of the effector organ, okay? We're going to see this structure called a varicosity. So when we were talking about our neurons before, we looked at their axon terminals and we thought about the axon terminals as a place where they're releasing their neurotransmitters. Now we have a slightly different structure. We have these extra swellings along these ends of our neuron, essentially, right? So as our axon splits out, we have these varicosities, okay? These varicosities are storing neurotransmitters, and then we're going to release those neurotransmitters from all these varicosities and kind of spread out this effect along these kind of like spaghetti fingers of the postganglionic neuron. Okay. So varicosities rather than axon terminals here. So a varicosity does look a lot like our axon terminal did before. Okay, so it's going to have a synaptic vesicle in it. Okay, synaptic vesicle. Okay, the neurotransmitter is inside it. Right. We still have a voltage-gated calcium channel. It's going to trigger the release of those neurotransmitters. So the only difference really is that the axon is continuing and then would hit another varicosity with all these same structures inside as well. Okay, so we are going to stop there for today. I'll go through those links and see exactly what I linked you to, and we'll make any adjustments necessary next week.